guys, welcome to another edition, a special edition of our Capital Conversations. This is something that we launched during lockdown, and it's lifted off beautifully. I'm really, really proud of the effort of the Brand Capital team, and thanks to all our guests for making this such a big success. Today we have a special edition. It's our 14th, and we have Professor Michael Gibbs. Professor Michael Gibbs is a very special person in my life, and at the end of this is going to be a very special person in all your minds as well. Let me try and give you a brief intro of Professor Gibbs. I call him Mike. Guys, you can't do that in India. Professors are called professors, so don't make that mistake. In America, it's okay. It's forgiven a little bit. Anyway, Mike is a renowned scholar and a practitioner in the field of economics, and has been at it for a very long time. A lot of that time, almost all that time, in the University of Chicago. All his education has been there. He's done research elsewhere in Harvard and so forth. But he's a Chicago man, lives in Hyde Park, and now works with the university, teaches, and he has taught me, my brothers and sisters, very close to my family as well. Now, it's quite difficult to do justice. I'll give you explaining Mike's background. He'll share a little bit about Chicago once I finish doing this. He's an author of a popular book, Personal Economics in Practice, which is used in translated in different languages, used for research and for teaching in places. He's contributed hundreds of articles in different journals, peer-reviewed, and he's a clinical professor. And prior to this, he also headed the international program, the international MBA, the executive MBA program. And Mike, I mean, he's based in Chicago, but during those few years, 5 years, I think, Mike was always on a plane, traveling everywhere. So that is and then he's also taught at Harvard, Michigan, USC or UCLA, I don't know. Where's Marshall School of Business? Where is that?
USC.
USC. So USC. So Mike is taught in different places, and now in Zoom, I think he's teaching all over, even in India. I think Mike is taught in India at the University of Chicago in Delhi. Am I correct, Mike?
Yes, we have a center off Connaught Place. I taught there a couple of times.
Yeah. So Mike has taught, I don't know in how many countries, too many countries, and now with Zoom, I think he's going everywhere. Wonderful. Welcome, Mike. So Mike, without any delay, I'll get going. We'll start with this. We'll start with you giving a little bit of summary about yourselves as you see fit, and also about University of Chicago, which is an important connection between you and I, and economics and University of Chicago, the history, the knowledge, everything else there. That's what we are going to enjoy today. So kindly give us a little bit of background summary about yourself and the University of Chicago.
Okay, sure, I'll try. First, good evening, everyone. I think it's evening there, right? It's 7:30 in the morning here. I have my coffee. Thank you all for taking the time. I wish I could see your faces, but I do appreciate your coming this time. And Sammy, it's always good to see you in person or on Zoom. My great friend for, I think, 20 years now. Yeah. I think you graduated 20 years ago, or you started the program 20 years ago. Thank you for inviting me to this, event. You asked me to say something about the University of Chicago, I guess. The University of Chicago it lacks the brand name of certain other schools, such as an MIT or a Stanford or something like that. So it is a bit of a secret to some, although it's becoming less so. University of Chicago is one of the top research universities in the world. We have had the most Nobel laureates on our faculty or who were students, 92 by current count. We're particularly famous for our physicists and our economists. The first self-sustaining nuclear reaction was by Enrico Fermi, just before, in the middle of World War II. It was done under our football stand, where our football stadium was. Now that's a historical site. And we're particularly renowned, I think, for economics. We've had 30 Nobel laureates in economics on the faculty or who are graduates We have 6 who are currently on the faculty and not retired, 3 in the Department of Economics, and 3 in the Booth School of Business. So we have economists all over the faculty. When I left high school, I went to the University of Chicago for college. October 1st, 1980, I first showed up on campus. And I got my bachelor's degree there and my master's and my PhD in economics. What happened in my case is I stumbled on a class being taught by a professor named Gary Becker, who I think ended up, arguably was the greatest economist of all time. He was the best student of Milton Friedman, some of you have heard of. And I took his class as an undergraduate, and then I was lucky to work with him throughout the PhD. So sometimes you just get connected to great people, and it's a very lucky thing. My connection to Sammy is another example of that. So when I was a student, I took classes with 7 different Nobel laureates in economics, 2 or 3 in college, and then the rest in graduate school. It's just an incredible place. One of my colleagues, many of you will know, is Raghuram Rajan, who served as the head of the IRB. Is that correct?
Yes.
Yes, for some years. And of course, he is from India. He's an absolutely brilliant colleague. I have many, many students from India. We have a program, we have an executive MBA program, as Sammy has mentioned, which has campuses in Chicago, London, and Hong Kong, and the students fly in from all over the world. So I teach on those campuses every year, except during COVID, I couldn't get to Hong Kong this year. And so I teach students from about 55 different countries every year, many from India, on either the Hong Kong or Chicago or London campuses. I've actually done a little bit of research in India, published a study using data from HCL Technologies, which is based in Noida. So I've been there a couple of times on employee innovation, very impressive company. And I've been to Delhi a couple of times, but never to Mumbai.
Well, we have to fix that.
Mm-hmm.
Good. It's a powerful introduction of yourself to the University of Chicago, and it's the best way to hear it is from you, and that's why I asked you to share that. Thank you, Mike. So the topic today is around corporate governance, Mike. It's a topic that we've discussed a lot. It's a topic you research a lot about, and you know a lot about. And it's a topic that is dear to us. Prime Capital, our team, we are in the business of investing. We invest media capital in companies, and we have more than 800 portfolio companies in our life. At any given time, we are looking at more than 100 companies to invest in. And corporate governance is a very important thing for us, not just for our own business operations, but also for the companies that we look at. And if the corporate governance is good, we stand to benefit, or not. If it's not, then we stand to suffer some risk. So generally, directionally, we all know that. But it's not something that is easy to measure, like EBITDA, growth rate, customers, revenue, this sort of stuff. So I want to talk a little bit about that with you today. Does the first question, does the robustness of a corporate governance framework, Mike, in a company, does it have a direct impact on the valuation of the company and the shareholder value of this company? I mean, how does this impact differ between a public company and private company broadly? But you know, share some cases or whatever your views are on that topic.
Okay, sure. Almost all the evidence that we have, when I say evidence, I mean academic evidence, statistical research, is going to be from public companies because they have to disclose their practices, and we have much more data. So there are some important distinctions between private and public, and maybe we can talk about that. I'm going to guess that most of your investments are in private companies, or some public? Or?
Yeah.
Mostly private, yeah, okay. I think the evidence is clear that governance matters a great deal to corporate performance. There's a variety of evidence of these kind on different practices and their correlation with improved firm performance, stock price growth, earnings, innovation, long-term strategic behavior, and so forth. But it tends to be correlations, and it's a little rough. And I think we need to dig into that a little bit. I'm not sure. I'm sorry. Give me a more specific question. Let's dig in a little bit. I think that'd be.
The hypothesis says that whether a company is private or public, the ingredients for a company's success are pretty much the same thing. Very good talent, a good approach or a good product or a good set of services, good marketing, good capital management, and good corporate governance. That's very important for a company to succeed, be it private or public. So if the data is available on public, that directionally gives us information. Now that's a pretty reasonably good proxy for a private company as well, by way of us looking at it for diligencing. And that's where my head is.
Yeah,
And
okay.
so with this group, if you can share some case studies of things that you looked at or worked at and how those things link, that would be very powerful.
Yeah, well, let me step back just a second and say, why do we even need governance in the first place? If you're an entrepreneur and you start a company, you're highly motivated to maximize the value of your enterprise because you own it 100%. But at some point as you grow, you probably are going to need capital to continue to grow, to finance your operations. You may need some outside expertise and so forth. So at some point you may bring in an investor. And once you do that, then you have a separation to some extent of ownership from control, management of the company. So in the most extreme case, you have a large corporation with hundreds of thousands potentially of shareholders, each who own a very small percentage of the firm. And then you have a manager, a professional, a CEO like Sammy running the business on their behalf. And so there's a potential conflict of interest there. Someone's running my business for me. Their interests are not the same as mine. They're not as motivated to create wealth for me as they would be if this was their own company. And on the same side, if I'm a diversified shareholder and I'm owning a portfolio of investments in different companies, I don't have much incentive to monitor the CEO either. So this is where governance comes into play. When we have a separation of, when we bring in outside investors, and that's often the case in a private company as well as in a public company. So in both cases, Sammy, you're exactly right. Good governance is crucial to try and align management of the company with what the shareholders are trying to achieve, which most of the time is, increasing the value of the firm. And the principles are largely the same. The one thing that's an important distinction, well, there's a couple, but when you have a publicly traded company, you have other kinds of pressures on management. And by pressures, I mean that as a good thing. There may be CEOs in the room here who don't think that's a good thing. But as an economist, I mean that. Pressures on management to manage the company well. The most important being the stock market. We have a performance measure every second of the day telling us whether we're doing a good job or a poor job. And by and large, stock prices are pretty good performance measures, especially in relatively modern economies like India or the United States. And you don't have that in a private company. So valuation and performance evaluation is trickier. In a public company that you have many regulations about disclosure and the audits and so forth and so on, there's lots of rules and regulations, government monitoring you, and you don't have that in a private company either. More or less, roughly speaking, governance is completely at your discretion. In a private company, you can choose to do what you want or not do what you want. There are some other differences, of course. In a private company, ownership tends to be highly concentrated. A small number of people or groups own a high percentage of the firm, and therefore they have pretty strong incentives to care about making sure that the company operates well, usually. Often, especially in a country like India, some of those groups will be family offices, or maybe it's a family-run firm, family-founded firm, and that raises other issues as well. I just raised a whole bunch of issues, so I guess I'm looking for a direction you'd like to go at this point.
I think we'll build on it as we discuss, because this is a point. We look at investing in public and private companies, but the majority of them, let's say 98% of the companies we invest in or we look at investing in, are private companies, because brand capital gives growth equity, and growth equity is largely for companies that can't get capital so easily. Public companies have an avenue, ready avenue to go get capital in the public markets. Actually, it's somewhat cheaper than private equity, so they go there. And although that has been proven to be wrong in the case of Uber and so forth, which had higher private valuations than public valuations, that is recently. But generally speaking, public markets are cheaper. So they present less opportunities for us. For us, they are private companies. Some of them get listed, our private companies. But the point, I think my next couple of questions will open I'll peel the onion a little bit more. We are in the business of diligencing companies every day and ascertaining a value of the company and taking a piece of it for giving media capital. Are there any good tools out there? Because there are tools to measure the other health of a company using numbers and data and interviews and so forth. Are there other telltale signs, some tools to look at to measure the good governance health of a company that we're looking at looking to invest in, and what the possible outcomes may be for that?
So let's talk about public companies. Private companies is more difficult, but we definitely want to come back to those two. With public companies, there are all sorts of ratings that you can get of corporate governance of companies, and I think those ratings serve a purpose. I will tell you that the correlation between a company's rating by Institutional Shareholder Services or in one of these other groups, the correlation between these ratings and actual stock performance is very close to zero. They predict very little. And I think I want to illustrate that with an example. So many in your audience will be familiar, of course, with Satcham, the horrible Satcham scandal in India on about 2007, I think it was. I just taught that case to my students last week. So Satcham was one of the finest companies in India. They did all of the things that you're supposed to do with respect to corporate governance, having a board of so-called independent outside directors, including one who is a professor at Harvard Business School, a former colleague of mine who was an accounting professor. Satcham won 2 Golden Peacock Awards for best corporate governance practices in India. It was listed on the New York Stock Exchange and NASDAQ and one of the European exchanges. I think it was in Holland. They were doing everything right. And Raju, the CEO, won awards for best entrepreneur of the year and so forth and so on. They had PwC as their auditor, one of the world's most renowned auditing companies, a global company. There's no way that you would look at that and say there's anything wrong here. And their corporate governance ratings were as high as could possibly be. And of course, it was all a massive fraud with 13,000 fake employees and so forth and so on. Related party transactions with the family business Mehtas, which is Satcham spelled backwards, and so forth. So this illustrates that a company can on paper look like it's doing perfect corporate governance. It's actually pretty easy to check the boxes and look like you're doing exactly the right things. And so for this reason, I think these ratings, they're sort of an important base case. If you're not doing these things, then that's clearly a problem to be solved. But just checking these boxes means very little by itself. It's a base case to start from, but I would never rely on such pro forma analysis of governance of any company in any country.
And sticking with the Satyam example, given that you've stated that you can't just go by the numbers published out there or the awards and those things as matrices, what would one do if one has to look at making an investment in a company? What are 1 or 2, 3 things we can do outside of those matrices or data that's openly published? Yeah. What kind of questions can we ask that can give us some ideas?
Yeah, of course, the first thing you want to look at is the business itself. Is it a good business, right? But that's separate from governance, potentially. So I'm an economist. I do statistical work. I tend to think in terms of formal modeling and all of these things. Very analytical. I teach courses in microeconomics. But when I teach my course on corporate governance, I emphasize to the students, I'm not going to teach you the laws and the rules. You can go learn that stuff elsewhere, because governance is a soft skills field. It's all about the culture of the board, its interactions, working relationship with the CEO. It's about the personalities, the extent to which there's integrity and candor among the directors and the CEO. And these issues about the personality of the person and their values and the interactions among the players are essential to good governance. You know, a lot of what I teach the students is to start thinking about these things. So trying to assess that from outside is really quite a challenge. If you are, if you're an independent investor, it's going to be extremely difficult for you to do so. But in your situation at Brand Capital, you do have more opportunity because you're meeting with the management team. You're getting to know them personally. And I think that's incredibly important to good due diligence. You really want to try and assess the intangibles, the human factor behind governance, because that's the only thing at the end of the day that's going to protect you from something like a Sacham disaster.
So listen to the whispers, listen to the things that are not said, talk a lot to management, and think about it. That is the message I'm getting from what you're saying.
Yeah. Yeah, and we could. So the first is one thing you want to think about as the CEO. We should talk a little bit more about what kind of things you might be wanting to think about the CEO, particularly that you might not normally think about. But then the second is also the board. Now, if you're in a private company, you have the ability to place your own members on the board. Yeah. That's important. And the dynamics are going to be somewhat different on a private board, but the dynamics of that board, the way they work together as a team, is going to be extremely important. In fact, perhaps the most important governance mechanism, since you're relying on a CEO to manage the company on your behalf.
True. Good points. Now, is there any difference between developed countries and developing countries on this? Do you see a difference between developed and developing countries based on your experience? Because you've worked in different countries, you've also worked with Indian companies, other companies. You teach about Satyam as a case study as well in your class, and you've done research. What's your experience on that?
There are some differences. People are people everywhere. I think there are probably two that come to mind. One is developing countries. And I think this was probably an issue with Sacham, and it's certainly an issue with India, which is growing rapidly, although maybe temporarily with COVID, things are slow. In a developing country where economy is growing very fast, new companies are starting up, new sectors are starting up that hadn't existed before, IT services in the case of Sacham. A company is going to be posting fantastic results, and it's going to be very easy for everyone, including investors and directors, to slip into the mode of things are going well. I don't need to pay much attention to this. We're all making lots of money. The stock price keeps going up. We're in a fantastic period of history in our country. And in that kind of situation, it is easy to not pay attention. I think that is natural. You know, why would anyone complain when things are going so well? And even if you did start raising tough questions, people would say, you're wasting our time. We're very busy. We're making a lot of money here. You know, just be quiet. I think you need to watch against that. And the other one is in developing countries, the institutions of society tend to not function as well. And by that, I mean the government. There may be more corruption, for example. Law enforcement may not be as reliable. Bribery may be important. Basically, the way business is done often has, we'd like business to be done by reliance on contracts, which are enforceable. We can make an agreement, we can rely on that agreement, and if we ever have to litigate, it will be litigated fairly and so forth. But in a country where we haven't developed those good legal and political institutions yet, we can't rely on that as much. And when we can't, then we have to rely more on, do we trust the person or the company with which we are thinking of doing business? And we should. And so personal reputation, the reputation of a family, in a family business, the extent to which someone is perceived as having integrity and so forth can matter a great deal. And interpersonal relationships can matter a great deal. People's networks are an important part of doing business in a developing country. Doing business with people that you went to school with, or that were a student of yours or something like that. And that's sort of a double-edged sword.
Mm-hmm.
it's a good way to govern working relationships. You know, I would be much more comfortable working with Sammy because I've known him for so long. I know his values. I trust him. I respect him. I know he has integrity. But on the other hand, if business is done and through close relationships between executives and investors and government regulators and so forth, that can easily turn into a form of corruption as well, crony capitalism, if you will.
And we know that has happened in places, and we know that we hear about it.
It happens in the United States too. Let's be honest. It happens everywhere.
It has happened in the United States too, and I've personally witnessed it. So basically, the message I'm getting is it can happen anywhere, developed or developing countries. You just need to pay a lot of attention to it and study it as much as you would study comparables and valuations and all this. Basically, we have to prioritize that part as much, because I've personally written off investments of tens of millions of dollars in different companies, written it off completely. And that is entirely due to corporate governance misses. And this has happened to me in America, this has happened to me in India. So there's no monopoly of one place where it can happen. The idea is, how do you diligence it, and how do you bell the cap? It's not easy. It's very hard. Basically, the main message I'm taking away from these comments from you is focus on it, be afraid of it, be very diligent, because you can't get it all right. You just have to keep looking constantly. And that's the main message.
Yeah, no, there are tells. Watch the directors and CEO in action. What are they focused on? Are they laser focused on the business, on creating value, on implementing the strategy, or something else? You know, I observed a CEO in Vietnam once of an incredibly successful, rapidly growing company, which was planning to do an IPO in Hong Kong and then expand throughout Asia. But when I visited him and his team in Ho Chi Minh City, I noticed that he was spending a lot of time driving fancy cars and going to nightclubs and stuff like this. And it was very different than the first time I'd met him, or my perceptions from different phone calls. And he seemed to be losing focus on the business. He was enjoying the money that he was making, and something he hadn't experienced before. And that's the kind of tell you can look at as well. You know, look at the board. Do they ask tough questions? Not just of a CEO, but of each other. Do they have high expectations for each other? We need to be reading these audit reports. We need to get outside accountants to help us assess them to the extent we don't understand them because of our skills. You know, it's a bit like the University of Chicago. You want people who are thinking hard, who are pushing each other to think hard, who are tough with each other, setting high standards our goal here is to find out what the truth is. Ironically, Satyam means truth in Sanskrit, I believe.
Yes.
Yeah.
Ironically. And Metas was the reverse of truth, and I think it was true as well. So sticking with that Vietnam example, Mike, it brought a thought to my mind. So when you're looking at a company, you know, we find different kind of founders. We find some kind of founders who are, they project their wealth, they're a little bit gaudy, flashy cars and all that sort of stuff. And then there are others. The others is actually very important, equally important in my experience, as part of the question, who project, you know, they would drive to work in a cheap car, and they'll proselytize frugality, and they are much more low-key, okay? They do the opposite. In fact, I worry about both ends, to your point. What are your views on that? Because those things are done by the CEOs, sometimes thoughtfully, sometimes without that much thought. In either case, when we are making an investment into the company, you know, one CEO once told me, Sammy, you know, privately, when we were together, I was making an investment. When we are going to visit the plant or something, we had to go in a cheap car. That's what he wanted to protect. And then we were off for a holiday abroad, and then it was a very different man. So he wanted to protect two different persona in order to drive his costs down in that case. And then that actually turned out to be a bad outcome. So I've learned from that. And your example of Vietnam is the other extreme. Let's talk about that a little bit. This is a little bit provocative, but I'm sure you have some good thoughts on this.
Yeah. So I have a broad comment, which, as you were speaking, I was thinking, well, what we really want is a CEO who doesn't put on an act, who is themselves and is genuine. And then you know what you're getting, and then you can assess whether that fits the business well. So Jeff Bezos is a great example, a fanatic about frugality. Amazon has 14 leadership principles, and literally one of them is frugality. You know, cheap desks and everything. And it's not BS. I almost used a French word there. It's not BS at Amazon. They're absolutely focused on cost cutting and efficiency and so forth, but it's a good fit for a business which is about logistics and supply chain and things like that. On the broader point though, there's some really fun and interesting research, academic research on the characteristics of CEOs and how they're associated with firm performance. Some of it's a little goofy, but I think it's thought-provoking, so I teach my students about it. So to give you one example, some professors wondered, can we say anything about the propensity for CEOs to commit fraud or their organizations to be financially lax and careless, which might lead to fraud or class action lawsuits or something like that? And so they collected data on the extent to which CEOs have a lavish personal lifestyle, like the example you mentioned. Literally in one case, some professors figured out the location of the CEO's house and then went on Google Maps to look at satellite view to measure the square foot of the building. Okay, you know, this is serious science here. But what they found is when a CEO built a new mega mansion, extremely large mansion, that the company they were running was more likely to have declining shareholder stock prices, and they were more likely to be involved in financial fraud in the ensuing years, suggesting something like my Vietnam story, that someone's enjoying their success and are losing focus on the business. Similarly, the research finds that when CEOs buy yachts or exotic race cars, the same thing applies. And by the way, this filters down to they're more likely to hire CFOs who are less financially rigorous, and those CFOs are more likely to commit financial fraud. So it's not just that the CEO is not paying attention to his or her job, but they're not paying attention to the staff who's doing the work for them.
I want to talk a little bit to your other area of expertise where I learned quite a bit from you. And I remember after 9/11 or 2002, when I worked with His Holiness at that time period, we talked a lot about compensation. And then we talked about it when I was at the GSB as well. I took your lessons or your class on compensation economics. We talked quite a bit about it, and you do a lot of work on this. Now, the question around that is, how does a company create, okay, the high level question is a compensation and a performance incentive structure that aligns with the goals of a company and creating lasting shareholder value? Now this question is probably 300 years old, 500 years old. Ever since people were paying people for doing work, this question was probably asked and answered in various different forms. But I'm going to make it a little more specific for our discussion as it relates to us and a lot in the modern economy. Fast-growing startups, Mike, which is most of our portfolio, they don't have that much cash. It's a constant challenge for them to do this. Especially in India, the average employee ownership, even in startups, is actually much lower than it is in the United States, if you compare, right? There's one thing. Number two, salaries in most startups is actually, except in a few unicorns and things like Uber and so forth, which are not even startups today. I'm talking about things in startups. The salaries are much lower. They're quite modest, all right? But people join these for name and fame and learning and experience. But there is a constant fight for talent, and there's a lot of regretted attrition. It happens all the time. The idea is, how does one go about creating a compensation structure? I mean, I see repeatedly startups. One of the reasons this question comes up in this discussion is I have invested in startups in America, in Europe, and even in rest of Asia. I find that the ownership of the company stock outside of the top two people is a little bit more than it is in India. In India, a lot of companies, which are multi-generational companies, meaning there is a patriarch, et cetera, the son or daughter of a source of capital. Typically, we see a lot of that, okay? And we see some where there are 2-3 people who start a company and they're equal owners. We see that too. That is the Flipkart type example. But for every one of those, we see 1 or 2 of the other kind, where the capital is coming from an established family source where there's capital. Now, especially in those, the equity ownership of the talent team is very, very small. It's not shared down from the top people. And then we have to make an investment in it. Whereas something like a Flipkart, which will be more similar to an American-style startup where it is much more democratically shared, the equity. Now, tell us if, companies big, small, how can they deal with this challenge? And how can we as investors influence portfolio companies in, one way or another to do something like this?
Okay. For a small startup, I think equity compensation for almost everyone, perhaps literally everyone, makes a lot of sense. If you have 5 people, even the administrative assistant running the office is a crucial key employee who will have a lot of impact on the success of the enterprise. The real issue for me is this phrase, key people. So I'll come back to that, key employees. The problem, so in the US, what we see is kind of the opposite of the problem you're talking about, too much granting of equity as companies become large companies rather than the opposite. So in the US, it is very common in startups to give options and or equity to most or all employees, literally even secretaries. And then as the company grows, that practice tends to continue. And then you end up with what Microsoft faced about 10 or 15 years ago, when it had several 100,000 employees, all of which owned stock. And then they had to try to unwind that practice because they found it wasn't working very well. It sounds like what you're saying is you have the opposite case where you don't have enough spread of equity. And in the startup phase, I think equity is an excellent form of compensation because the key issue for incentives is, what is my performance measure? What am I evaluated on? And is it something that is meaningful to the organization? It's correlated with what our goal is. And is it something that I have some control over? And when we have 5 people on a team, firm value or maybe profits, earnings, has both of those properties. It is closely tied to what our ultimate objective is, which in this case might be an IPO or acquisition. And it is something that all the employees have significant ability to control. The problem then, so I would in fact advocate, based on what I've heard you saying, considering spreading equity a little bit more broadly in new ventures in India. It might be something that you at Brand might want to think about as something you might build into your deals. Although I don't intend to advise you, especially in this public forum, just a thought. The tricky issue though is what happens when the company hits that growth stage. And now we're not 5 employees, we're 20, and then we're 100, and then we're 200, and then we're 1,000, and someday we might be 100,000, or something like that, like HCL.
Yes.
And then stock and options don't make sense as compensation except for a small percentage of employees. So if I'm an employee at a Microsoft, I don't know how many employees Microsoft has now, so I'll make up a number, 250,000 employees. Even if I'm a fairly senior person at Microsoft, stock price is not going to make sense as my performance evaluation, the way to measure my accomplishments. And the reason is, no matter how hard I try, unless I blow up corporate headquarters with explosives, whatever I do is not going to have any effect on stock price because there's 250,000 other people who are contributing to that performance measure. And that performance measure is very noisy because stock prices are very noisy. There's lots of macroeconomic forces on them. So you might as well just give me a lottery ticket and say, this is your performance evaluation. Your bonus is going to be based on this lottery ticket. Because I have as much ability to control a lottery ticket outcome as I do the stock price of Microsoft. Unless I'm a key employee of Microsoft, such as Satya Nadella, famous Indian, who also is a graduate of the University of Chicago, is now CEO of Microsoft. So it's about key employees. So the way to think about incentives is, what's the performance measure? That's always the hard question. What are the right metrics to measure somebody by? What are the right ways to do subjective valuation as well? And subjective valuation is extremely important. So to design compensation well, you have to measure each person's contributions to the enterprise in a way that is sensible, that is measuring for them on the things that they can actually have some control over.
And are there any examples of companies that, in your opinion, do this very well for us to look at and study a little bit deeper?
Well, I kind of hate to go back to Jack Welch at GE, because, you know, it's the old, but Jack Welch at GE was one of the greatest CEOs of all time.
Yes.
You know, GE has faltered in large part because Immelt and others may be great managers, but they're no Jack Welch. He was phenomenal. So I would go back and look at GE. Now, GE used force curve evaluations, and that's not what I want to focus on. Force curve evaluations, where people are rank ordered against each other, and have many problems, and I would not advise most companies to use them. But what was important at GE was Jack Welch had a very strong personal view that motivating and rewarding people carefully and aggressively was the way to create firm value. He believed this. He did it with his own top executives. He evaluated them very carefully. He spent a lot of time on it. He tied their rewards or their punishments to their performance pretty significantly. And if you believe that at the top, and you do that at the top, you're going to push that down. So General Electric had a culture of very careful evaluation, and it was evaluation based on the person's job, not on some giant Borg called stock price.
So you're basically saying that this compensation incentives should be taken as seriously as a function such as sales or product development or quality control, what have you. It requires that kind of careful handling that Jack, for example, Jack did. And what Jack did is quite well known. I myself have studied that quite a bit. And yeah, force curve, I know force curve very well. When I went to college in IIT, we had a force curve. And it was—
I should have used it on your classes at Booth at the University of Chicago.
University of Chicago was a force curve. University of Chicago was a more kind force curve, where we used to say, me and my classmates, that IIT was a ruthless force curve. We had a top grade of S. It was called superlative, which is 1% of the class or 1.5% of the class, which is a little subjective. But when a class is 50, who gets an S? And yeah, it was I think the force curve is a bit cruel. I do agree with you. I've suffered it in two universities, but a lot of companies do follow that. And that weeds out the bottom 5%. Unfortunately, sometimes you may be weeding out some good people in that bottom 5%. You shouldn't be losing at all, because when you're a high-performance organization, you can't afford to lose your bottom 5%. Your bottom 5% will be a good 5% for somebody else, and then you lose them. No, that's point very well taken.
So I'd like to circle back to corporate governance again, because it's literally the same principle. Corporate governance, to a large extent, is performance evaluation to motivate. That is probably the most important job of a board, especially in a public company, but even a private one, is to evaluate and motivate the CEO. It's also coaching and collaborating and helping, but there's a performance evaluation aspect. And I started in our session by talking about how governance is largely about the soft skills part. Performance evaluation is too, because for most people in most jobs, it's difficult to put a number on someone's performance. You can come up with a whole bunch of numbers and you can put them in a balanced scorecard, but they're going to miss intangibles that are really important, and that if you don't evaluate people on, they're not going to pay much attention to. So subjective performance evaluation is essential. just as it is for directors in governing a firm. And how do you do subjective performance evaluation? Well, first, you need to believe that it's a serious issue. You need to work hard at it. You need to set up a process by which it's done systematically and professionally. It has to be implemented fairly, so you're giving people a fair hearing. It has to be tough in the sense that if someone isn't performing well, you give them a chance to improve, but then maybe you do ask them to leave. And that's also true for a CEO. You need to give people the chance to speak up for themselves, to propose how to be evaluated themselves, to have some input into setting their targets and so forth. It's a relationship that you build. It's an ongoing process. It's, conversations throughout the year and so forth and so on. So exactly the same way I teach my students to do performance evaluation for a middle manager is the way I teach them they should be doing when they're on a board, on the compensation committee, evaluating a CEO. Principles are identical.
It's good. Very nice to see that you connected the two together. Good. Thanks, Mike. So now, one last question from me before I go off to questions from the group. So I was your student, I think, more than 20 years ago, 1999. That was a long time ago, Mike. This is a question that I'm sure lots of people in the group want to ask, but they're probably not asking. So just keep in mind when you answer this question, please don't disclose my grade. We had a non-grade disclosure policy. So how was Sammy as a student more than 2 decades ago? I'm sure somebody wants to hear this.
You know what? You're exactly the same now. You kind of look the same, although you have a little less hair. I can even remember the seat you were sitting in, which was not all the way in the back row, but it was pretty far back. I think you were sitting next to James Min, and I think he was on your left.
Yes.
This is the microeconomics class in Stewart Hall.
Yes.
For some reason, I remember that, and I can see your face. It was exactly the same. You were high energy, really enthusiastic, friendly, funny, always engaged and interested in everybody, very smart, very sharp and fast, and I guess that's what happens when you go to IIT or IIM or something like that. Another personal note, though, I do remember you were standing across the street from the World Trade Center when the South Tower collapsed. Yeah. And then you called me from the hospital the next day. That was a very difficult time for you. And then you went to work for His Holiness. I believe you called the Dalai Lama. But you have proven to be resilient and adaptable in a phenomenal way under pressure. And, I respect that a lot. So, I think of you as one of my gurus.
Thank you. Kind words. Thank you. I survived it. I survived the tough question. Thank you. So now we'll toggle to questions from the group. Partha.
Yep.
Partha is on the call, and Partha is the head of our business called Response, Mike. And Partha basically Response is all the direct sales of media from Bennett Coleman to our clients. So Partha is a strategist. He's also from IIT. So we are colleagues, and we're both from IIT. That makes life easy. And Partha, I'll kick off with Partha's question. Partha, go ahead.
Thanks, Sammy. Thank you, Michael. I've been listening with rapt attention. It's fabulous. I can kind of listen to you for the whole day. Unfortunately for that, I have to go to Chicago booth. I unfortunately studied.
You have a campus in London and Hong Kong that are a direct flight from Mumbai.
Oh yeah, I know that.
Or you could take Air India to Chicago. Not a great flight, but
yeah. But I did my MBA from one of the places you mentioned. I studied at IIM Ahmedabad. So your points are fascinating, and I have a question for you, because I also read up a little about you when I heard that you are coming, and like people economics is absolutely fascinating. So I want to deviate a little bit from board and corporate governance to like the workforce at large, and I want to talk a little about India to understand what is your point of view. See, for 30 years India has been told that it is a people driven economy, right? That demographic dividend, optimism, people power, everything was being like touted for 30 years, from pretty much from 1991 when the economy kind of opened up. and 3 months of lack of consumer demand, and people are being, like sacked from their jobs. There are unemployment. You know what happened with migrant laborers. It's like young people there on the street for 40 hours and 50 hours and 5 days, and so all on a sudden it looked like that people are everything about this economy. Suddenly it looks like that people can be people are really not that important. Like some other matrices are more important than people. So in this kind of a scenario, what happens to this big asset called people in an economy which is supposedly fully people driven?
I'm sorry, I'm not quite sure what you're driving at. I'm very concerned about the effects of COVID on the global economy, on the US economy, on the Indian economy. I've been watching India with concern for a couple of months, expecting COVID to get much worse. And I understand in Mumbai right now, it's a very serious outbreak. It's sad, but not surprising to hear. I think the economic effects of COVID are going to be with us. They're going to be quite serious, and they're going to be with us for quite some time. In my view, COVID isn't going to die off easily unless we get lucky with with some vaccines. We need more than one for different types of people, different medical conditions, or if we get therapeutics that work well. But at the moment, I'm not optimistic that we're going to get ones that we can scale up largely in the next 6 months, maybe even 12 months. And that means that we just have to live with this virus. We are getting better at learning how to live with this virus. There's a huge political fight right now in the US about wearing masks, for example, but I think more people are accepting that what we have to do is what is a common practice in East Asia, which is to wear masks in cases where there's more risk. And these things will help us live with the virus. We will find ways to protect senior citizens or most at risk of serious effects of getting COVID and so forth. But I think it's going to take a long time. I don't think we're going to get to so-called herd immunity very quickly. So we have to figure out ways to adapt to it. That worries me a great deal.
But let me just reframe it a little bit. I'm saying the way corporates have dealt with their own people, will it define the nature of the corporate as we go forward? That during this COVID period, how the corporates have dealt with people, because whether they put people before some like financial ratios, or they put people behind some financial ratios, there would be different kind of. So my question is around that how the nature of the corporate will.
Thank you, I appreciate that. I think what we're seeing is there's a big advantage to large companies in certain sectors. They have more financial resources, less likely to be high levels of debt, and therefore in danger of bankruptcy from the recession that we're facing right now. So I think we're going to see a bifurcated effect. Many small and to medium enterprises are likely to fail. Or to your question, they're going to have more layoffs, and they can't afford to be as generous to their employees during this period. But larger companies, by contrast, may be able to more easily, and that's going to give them more advantage in seeking and retaining talent throughout the crisis. The other thing is that companies whose businesses allow work from home are more likely to be able to survive and treat their employees well and keep them employed and so forth and so on, for obvious reasons. So it's going to be very different across different sectors. India is globally famous for its IT services, and those companies are going to do pretty well, I think. In fact, just as a side note, I was about to launch a field experiment in an Indian company, studying the effect of social networks, formation of social networks between employees, and the effect of that on employee innovation. But that company went to work from home, so there's no social network formation happening except online. And so instead, we are going to be studying the effect of work from home in that company on productivity. But that's a side note.
Thank you. I think so. What you're saying is it'll be a very sector dependent, story rather than an organization kind of principle or philosophy defined it.
Yes, and principles can only be implemented if they can be afforded to. So some of it's going to depend on the financial situation of the company.
Yeah, I completely understand. Thank you very much. It's not a principle if it doesn't cost you. You know, I think I was taught that somewhere. It is not a principle if it's not expensive. Thank you very much. I think we get a picture, but it'll be totally sector dependent. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Partha. Now, Mike, I have a few questions from the group, and they have sent it to me by text on the chat. So I'm trying to read it. The font is a little small. I think I went through them. Let me pose one of them to you. It's from Andreas. Andreas is from Ingelheim. So the question is, he asks about the European perspective. You mentioned about America and India, and we discussed that. Is there anything different by way of corporate governance and this topic when you bring in a European company in there? Are there any differences? We know that in German companies on the board, like Volkswagen, they have people from the employees, the labor on the board. And that is a German practice, unique German practice, we know that. So how does that play?
Yeah, it's a great question. Danke, Andreas. I speak ein bisschen Deutsch. So yeah, I didn't speak about Europe at all. Europe has a different approach to its social contract than the United States. The United States, we have a fairly clear distinction between corporate sector and the government sector. And largely speaking, the view famously put in words in 1970 by Milton Friedman is that the corporate social responsibility, the social responsibility of the corporation is to maximize profits or shareholder value. That is not the view in European countries. Most European countries, to some extent, it's the view in the UK, although that's not Europe for long, I suppose. So Germany does have co-determination laws, and it has 2 boards, but one of those boards has to have employee representation. Volkswagen, by the way, also has, I think, about 20% ownership by the government of Lower Saxony. So there's often government involvement in major corporations too. European countries often promote national champions. For a long time, Air France was one in France, although not anymore as I understand it. So it's just a different view of the social contract in which corporations are expected to take into account their effects on other stakeholders. The United States view is that the government is supposed to set up the rules of the game to make sure that we have protections, appropriate protections for various interests through the government and democratic process. So for example, if we're concerned about pollution by corporations, automobile manufacturers maybe, we set up laws about that, and we set up penalties for violating those laws, or we set up a fee for emitting carbon or whatever it would be. And then the view is if we can set up the laws in a reasonable and efficient way, then we can let corporations pursue their selfish interests within the structure of those laws. But it is absolutely the case that in Europe, it's a very different view. It's a controversial, it's hard to say what is best, I guess. This is a very deep question. You know, the US system tends to lead to more innovation, tends to lead to higher per capita income outcome, but it tends to lead to higher inequality as well. We have serious problems with inequality. Now, I'm a University of Chicago trained economist. This is the place where Milton Friedman came from. My teacher was Milton Friedman's greatest student. And I do assign his famous 1970 article to my corporate governance students. But I've been listening a lot to my colleague, Raghu Rajan, who has been speaking with concern about growing inequality and the political forces that is driving for 10 or 15 years. And I think he was quite prescient. What we've been seeing in modern economies since about 1980 is growing economic inequality, largely related to the information technology and telecom revolutions, leading to automation of a lot of so-called middle-class jobs, leading to higher values for people in cognitive fields like ours. Look at all of us, we're on a Zoom right now. I'm in Chicago, you're in Mumbai or wherever you are, and we're interacting. Technology is making us more productive. So we've seen growing economic inequality, and economic inequality causes all sorts of difficult political and social forces to get unleashed. In Europe, we saw the rise of Brexit. In the US, we've seen two different streams politically, Donald Trump on one side and Bernie Sanders on the other. I don't know if your audience is familiar with Bernie Sanders or not, but basically a kind of a socialist. He's happy to say so. Incidentally, an alumnus of the University of Chicago. So we're seeing more extreme political forces and less social cohesion. And I think these things matter a lot. And the European system, I think, is much better at muting those forces. So these are all trade-offs. I don't know, Andreas, if I've actually answered your question or not, but certainly as a director, you are expected to trade off shareholder value for other kinds of interests more than you do in the United States.
Yeah, I mean, we have United States and we have Western Europe. The socialized democracies of Western Europe, Denmark, the most socialized would be Denmark, Norway, Sweden, Finland, those Nordic sort of countries. And then, of course, Germany is close to that. Britain would be a little bit in between, as they are in between in the Atlantic Ocean, between America and Europe. But India is in between as well. India is in between as well. We're not exactly where Europe is, and we're not exactly where United States is. So some of what you say applies to India. And I think as economies expand and grow, shareholder value, while it's extremely important, me as an investor, I really care about sustainable shareholder value. But of course, we exit after a 4-year, 5-year period as investors. But I think where you're getting to and where the Europeans are thinking, and what Raghu is also referring to, is to create sustainable value, create companies and establishments for the long haul, rather than come in and out and create value and harvest it and go away, which is a little bit more shorter duration. When you take a longer duration, when Volkswagen, when they went through the diesel scandal, if you recall, and they had a huge problem, it came up. Volkswagen weathered it very well. And I was one of the small beneficiaries because I bought the stock, because my view was the German corporate governance system will come in and the government will come in and help them get around it, and they did. So that probably builds more resilience in the time of a crisis to protect the company. Now toggling to COVID, Mike. COVID is a crisis upon every company. During any time, you can take the Volkswagen example. Somebody asked a question on corporate governance. There is this healthy tension between shareholders and management in many companies, as we saw in Volkswagen. Now, the tensions can flare up much more during a COVID environment. There are budgetary pressures, there are target pressures, there are focus pressures, cash flow pressures, multiple pressures will be there. Do you think there is a greater chance of corporate governance lapses and problems during this risk? People's eye on the ball is a little less, perhaps.
Oh, I don't know. I think it might be the opposite. If I was a director of a company right now, I would be attending many more meetings and demanding many more meetings because there's a crisis. The crisis tends to focus people, and it tends to align them as well. The only qualification I would have to that is when an organization is under high pressure, it's also more tempting to cut corners and do some things that that might be fraudulent or bordering on fraudulent or unethical or harmful to your reputation going forward. So there is a short-term pressure there that is very serious from COVID.
Yeah, well, I think we do know that during COVID, boards and management are talking a lot more. They're spending more time. In our own company, we're spending a lot of time. All these topics that we are discussing today are very fresh in our minds. We are burning the midnight oil on it. In fact, if you really ask me, as a member of the senior management, I spend a lot of time worrying about it, and also we discuss it, and we're doing everything we can to protect every person. Because at the end of this, economy will come back, market will come back. It will look slightly different, but the rules of engagement are largely going to be the same. People are going to need products. People are going to need services. How you deliver them, how it reaches them, how urgent they need them, and the type of products. They may change a little bit, but people are just going to need all these things. And so keeping that in mind, we try to see what we can do now to stay agile. So when we come out, we can gain market share, we can gain profitability, and then surge forward. So it's a burning topic. I agree with you. So I do agree with you that it's possible that there is a greater collaboration between shareholders and the board during this time than before. One more question. We're at 7:10 here. I know we are going after time. There's a question. It's a little bit, do you know what a CSAT survey is? Or is that something that's Indian? Somebody has asked.
Satisfaction?
I think that's probably what it is. So the question is there any market difference in the value of customer testimonials for a B2B company versus a B2C company, as is reflected in CSAT surveys from time to time? For example, he's saying if a CSAT scores are sub 6, it's kind of a warning signal. How does, in a B2C company? He's asking, how does CSAT, customer satisfaction, work in a B2B company differently from a B2C company?
Oh dear, you're asking me a question about marketing, and I know nothing about that. But so a 6, I assume you're talking about a net promoter score there on a scale of 1 to 10 or something. Propensity for a customer to recommend the business to others or something along those lines. I'll try to come up with an answer because I'm a professor. I think B2B, the marketing cycle is much more complicated and long-term and negotiation and meetings and so forth. I think a score matters a lot less in that case because you're building a relationship and doing it, and the sales cycle can be quite long. Although maybe I'm thinking about certain types of products with long sales cycles. It may not be the case for others. I'm sorry, I don't have a good answer to that one. It's outside my area of expertise. Sorry, Jaidev.
I don't know where the question came from, but it's a question out there. And I'll ask one last question because I know you have got to go for your day. Here's a question. How do we as investors deal the best way with agency cost with respect to senior management? Senior management compensation tied up with shareholder value creation. Is that a solution like in Tesla? Because Elon Musk has this outsized compensation model that he has set up where he gets, what, $1 billion or something of that nature, or $2 billion, something of that nature if he meets certain targets. That's what he's getting at. I think he has something in mind to ask me.
Yeah, Tesla is one of my favorite topics. There's so many angles one could take with that, and I have some familiarity with Elon Musk's compensation plan because I'm planning to discuss it in my class on Friday, actually. So I think Elon Musk's compensation package is actually pretty good. He takes essentially $1 of salary or something like that. It's all equity based. It's very strong equity based. If he were to get $1 billion in compensation, only after meeting a variety of different hurdles. I think there are 12 different operational targets and a bunch of stock price targets as well. So the fact that he gets disgustingly rich if Tesla does well, I think is a good thing for maximizing shareholder value, even if it's disgusting to watch. There's some problems I have with how it's set up with all of these various hurdles, because that can lead to short-term pressures to manipulate the stock price through Twitter and all that. And I think arguably he may be doing that sometimes. So I think the targets I think are problematic, the use of stock and the high percentage of potential ownership by Elon Musk. Those are good things. On a separate note though, Tesla uses dual class shares, voting shares and non-voting shares. And I find those to be a highly problematic practice. Very, very common in India. What that means from an investor point of view is that Musk and his family members control the company. They also control the board, although now they'll claim it's more independent. And there's nothing you can do to stop him if he decides to blow the whole thing up or goes crazy or spends too much time learning how to dig holes in the ground or to fly to Mars. But that's a separate issue from compensation. His compensation package is pretty good, in my view.
Good. That's a very proper University of Chicago branded outlook, and I would have answered it pretty much the same way. But the thing about the tweets and all those, I think that's it's worrying for me too. There should be some kind of gag on that from the board, preventing him from saying his stock is overvalued, undervalued. Saudis are looking at investing in my company and things like that. I think those are, I mean, you know, those are obvious, everything written all over it that it's not right, but he's doing it, getting away with it.
CEOs and presidents should not be allowed to run their own Twitter feeds.
Exactly. I support that. Mike, it's been a unique pleasure. Thank you so much for taking a chunk of your day. We truly appreciate it. And I look forward to doing this in your class when we do it next. I'm looking forward to it. I think we're doing it in the next 2-3 weeks or so. And look forward to meeting you soon. At Awana and Sloan Square or wherever else we'll meet, somewhere else, and give my best to the family, to Catherine. And look forward to catching up very soon. And we'll do one more show, hopefully on some other topic later in the year.
Thank you, Sammy, and to all of you, I want to thank you for taking your time, and I also wish you and your families health and safety during COVID, and I hope this is all behind all of us soon.
Thank you very much, Mike. Thank you.